There is a sentence that Gregory Peck's daughter once said in an interview, and it stops you cold the moment you really hear it. She said that of all the children in the world who wished they had Atticus Finch for a father, she was one of the lucky few who actually did. She meant it literally. The man who played the most beloved father in the history of American cinema, the quiet, principled small-town lawyer who taught a generation what decency looked like, was, by her account, very much that same man at home. Kind, loving, firm, steady. The genuine article. And yet here is the part almost nobody talks about. Behind that perfect on-screen father stood a real family, and real families do not get to live inside a movie. A movie ends after 2 hours. The credits roll, the lights come up, and everyone goes home to a life that keeps moving with all its accidents and heartbreaks and second chances still ahead. Gregory Peck lived to be 87, and across those decades he was not only the world's idea of the ideal father, he was an actual father to 5 real people who loved him, worried him, made him proud, and broke his heart, sometimes all at once. Gregory Peck had 5 children across 2 marriages, and their lives together carried more grief, more reinvention, and more quiet heroism than any single film role could ever contain. One of them died young in a way that shattered his father and haunted the family forever after. One of them came home from a war his own father had publicly opposed, and then spent his entire life pulling other broken soldiers back from the edge. One of them traded Hollywood for the campaign trail and then for a classroom. One of them nearly destroyed himself chasing the very fame his father had earned. And one of them picked up a camera and turned it toward the darkest corners of the world, telling the stories no one else would. Their names were Jonathan, Stephen, Carey, Anthony, and Cecilia. And what became of them? Long after the Oscar and the standing ovations and the final curtain, is a story about what it actually means to be raised by a good man, and about how even the best father in the world cannot protect his children from everything. Let's begin with the eldest, the son whose story is the hardest to tell, because it is the one that ended far too soon. The son who was lost. Jonathan Peck was born in 1944, the first child of Gregory Peck and his first wife, Greta Kukkonen, a Finnish-born woman who had worked as a hair and makeup stylist. At the time Jonathan arrived, his father was just becoming a star, one of the handsome young leading men Hollywood leaned on heavily during the war years, and the household that surrounded the boy was a rising one, full of promise and motion. By every account, Jonathan was a golden child in the most literal sense. He was a champion runner in high school, a genuine track star with the kind of natural athletic gift that turns heads. He was ambitious and adventurous. He volunteered for the Peace Corps and spent time serving overseas, reportedly 2 years in Tanzania, throwing himself into a life of purpose, far from the comforts his father's fame could have handed him. He served in the Marine Corps Reserves. He graduated from Occidental College. And then he chased a career that fit his restless, curious mind perfectly. He became a journalist. Jonathan started in radio at KNX in Los Angeles, spent about 3 years learning the craft, and then moved into television, working as an on-camera news reporter, including work for the wire service UPI. By the mid-1970s, he was building exactly the kind of independent, self-made life that any father would be proud of. A life earned on his own merits, under a last name that could easily have opened every door for him, but which he seemed determined not to lean on. Colleagues who knew him described a smart, driven young man who wanted to be judged for his own work, not for whose son he was, and who was quietly succeeding at exactly that. He was, by all appearances, thriving. That is what makes what came next so difficult to comprehend, and it is a truth that anyone who has lost someone this way understands all too well. From the outside, so often, there is no visible crack. The resume keeps building. The smile stays in place. The person the world sees remains, right up until the end, the accomplished and capable figure everyone believed them to be. Whatever Jonathan was carrying, he carried it where no one could see it, behind the poise and the promise, in a place none of the people who loved him could reach in time. And then, in 1975, at the age of just 30, Jonathan Peck died by suicide. There is no way to soften that fact, and it would be wrong to try. The details have always remained largely private, held close by a family that has, understandably, chosen not to turn its deepest wound into public spectacle. What is known is that his death came without the kind of warning that might have let anyone intervene, and that it landed on his father like a collapse. Those close to Gregory Peck have described it as the single greatest sorrow of his life, a grief that never fully lifted, that he carried quietly beneath the composed public dignity everyone associated with him. Here was a man the whole world looked to as the embodiment of steadiness and moral strength, and he could not save his own son. No amount of fame, no amount of love, no amount of anything could change what had happened. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because it cuts against the entire myth. We look at a figure like Gregory Peck and we assume that a life that gilded must be a life protected, that the children of the beloved and the accomplished are somehow shielded from the ordinary catastrophes that befall the rest of us. They are not. Depression does not check a person's last name. Despair does not care how kind your father was. And the terrible truth buried in this family's story is that the most decent father in Hollywood still had to bury a child, and still had to live nearly 30 more years carrying a loss that no role, no award, and no ovation could ever touch. Gregory Peck rarely spoke about it publicly, and when he did, it was with a restraint that only hinted at the depth underneath. Those who knew him said the loss made him gentler, more present with his other children, more aware of how fragile even the strongest seeming life can be. Jonathan's death became the quiet, permanent shadow at the edge of the family portrait, the absence that shaped everything that came after. And it makes what his younger brother chose to do with his own life all the more remarkable, because Stephen Peck came home from a war and decided to spend the rest of his days making sure other people would not be lost the way his brother had been. The soldier who saved the broken. Stephen Peck was born in 1946, the second son of Gregory and Greta, and his path would take him somewhere almost no other child of Hollywood royalty ever went. He went to Vietnam. This was no small thing. And not only for the obvious reasons. Stephen's father, Gregory Peck, had become an outspoken opponent of the Vietnam War, a prominent liberal voice who used his considerable public standing to argue against the very conflict his son would go on to serve in. Imagine the tension inside that household. A father famous around the world for his moral clarity, publicly protesting a war, while his own son puts on the uniform of a Marine lieutenant and ships out to fight it. It could have torn a family apart. By most accounts, it did not. Stephen served honourably, and his father, whatever his politics, stood by him as a son. It was, in its own way, a live demonstration of the same principle Peck had played on screen so many times, the idea that you can love someone completely while disagreeing with them profoundly. Stephen came home from Vietnam changed, as nearly everyone who went there did. And rather than bury what he had seen, he turned it into the defining mission of his life. He became an activist for Vietnam veterans, and eventually he found the cause that would consume his best decades. He devoted himself to homeless veterans, the men who had served their country and then fallen through every crack in it, ending up on the streets, forgotten by the nation that sent them to war. Stephen became the president and chief executive of U.S. Vets, which grew into the largest organization in the country dedicated to serving homeless veterans, providing housing, counseling, job training, and a path back to dignity for tens of thousands of men and women. This is not the kind of work that gets you on a magazine cover. It is the work of showing up, day after day, to a problem that never fully solves and never fully ends, of finding beds for men who have slept under freeways, of sitting across from someone whose war never really stopped and convincing him that his life is still worth rebuilding. It is slow, it is grinding, and it is heartbreaking as often as it is triumphant. Think about the quiet grandeur of that choice. He could have done anything. He carried one of the most respected names in American culture. He could have coasted on it, traded on it, chased the spotlight his father lived under for half a century. Instead, he spent his life in the least glamorous work imaginable, sitting with broken, addicted, traumatized former soldiers and helping them find their way home. There were no premieres, no ovations, no golden statuettes for the thousands of veterans Stephen Peck helped pull off the streets. There was only the work itself and the lives it saved. which is a kind of reward that never appears on any award stage but outlasts nearly everything that does. And it is impossible not to hear the echo of his own family's tragedy in that work. Stephen had watched his older brother, a Marine himself, a man of promise and service, be lost to a private darkness. And then he spent his life throwing ropes to other men, drowning in exactly that kind of darkness. Nobody in the family ever framed it that way publicly, and Stephen was far too modest to claim it. But the shape of it is unmistakable. Out of one family's deepest grief came a lifetime of pulling strangers back from the edge. Stephen also nurtured a lifelong love of film, working in the industry at various points. But it was the veterans' work that became his legacy. He married the food writer and editor Christine Kidd, and he built a life of substance and service far from the marquee lights his father lived under. When people talk about which of Gregory Peck's children most fully inherited his moral core, the sense of duty, the instinct to use one's position on behalf of the powerless, they very often land on Stephen. He did not play a hero on a screen. He simply was one quietly, for decades. If Stephen carried his father's conscience into the world of veterans, the third son carried it somewhere else entirely, into the arena Gregory Peck had only ever flirted with. The messy, bruising, public world of American politics. The son who ran for office, Cary Paul Peck, was born in 1949, the youngest of the three sons from Gregory's first marriage. Like his brothers, he grew up in the strange gravity of a famous household. And like them, he showed little interest in simply cashing in on it. He made a cameo or two in his father's world, but the screen was never where his ambitions lay. Cary wanted to change things, and he came to believe the way to do that was through public service. He graduated from Georgetown University, served in the Peace Corps, following the same idealistic path his late brother Jonathan had walked. And then, in the late 1970s, he did something genuinely bold. He ran for the United States Congress as a Democrat in Southern California. And here the famous last name became both a blessing and a burden. It opened doors and drew attention, but it also invited the inevitable skepticism that trails the children of the famous into any serious arena. Was he a real candidate, or a celebrity's son playing at politics? Cary ran hard, and he ran close. He mounted 2 congressional campaigns against a Republican incumbent, and though he came near, he lost both times. Anyone who has ever poured themselves into a campaign that falls just short knows the particular ache of that outcome. The months of door-knocking and fundraising and speeches, the volunteers who believed in you, the raised hopes, and then the narrow, deflating defeat on election night. To do it once takes courage. To pick yourself up and do it all over again, knowing exactly how much it can hurt, takes something more. Cary absorbed those losses, worked for a time as a bank officer, and then did something that says a great deal about his character. He did not disappear into bitterness or trade on his name for an easier life. He did not become the cautionary tale of the famous son who never found his footing. He went to work, and eventually he found his way to the cause that would define his later decades: education. For years, Cary Peck worked as a principal analyst and grant administrator for the Los Angeles Unified School District, one of the largest school systems in the nation. And within that unglamorous bureaucratic role, he became a genuine force for good, helping to pioneer after-school programs designed to reach the students the system too often left behind. He championed initiatives aimed at drawing girls and disadvantaged kids into science and technology education, into fields that had historically shut them out, working on programs like Cyber Patriots and student leadership campaigns that opened real doors for young people who needed them. It is a quiet second act, but a deeply meaningful one, and it fits the family pattern almost perfectly. Where the father used a movie screen to model justice and decency, the son used a school district to actually deliver it, one after-school program at a time, to kids whose names would never appear on any marquee. Cary married the acclaimed environmental and installation artist Lita Albuquerque, building a life rich in creativity and purpose. He is remembered by those who worked with him not as a movie star's son, but as a tireless public servant who cared genuinely about giving overlooked children a fighting chance. 3 sons from the first marriage, 3 lives shaped by service and idealism, and one shattering loss at the center of them. But Gregory Peck's story did not end with that first family. In the mid-1950s, he met a woman who would change the course of his life, and together they would have 2 more children, whose paths would carry the family in dramatically different directions, one toward the edge of self-destruction, and one toward some of the bravest storytelling of her generation. The son who nearly lost himself. In 1953, while filming the beloved romance Roman Holiday in Europe, Gregory Peck met a young Parisian journalist named Véronique Passani. She had come to interview him, and by the time the interview was over, something had shifted. He divorced his first wife in 1955 and married Véronique that same year, beginning the second great chapter of his personal life, one that by all accounts brought him a deep and lasting happiness that had eluded him earlier. Together they had 2 children, a son, Anthony, born in 1956, and a daughter, Cecilia, born in 1958. Anthony Peck, known to nearly everyone as Tony, grew up immersed in the glamour of his father's world in a way his older half-brothers never quite had. Because he was the child of Peck's settled, prosperous, movie star middle age. He spent summers on his father's film sets, including time in Rome, absorbing the intoxicating rhythms of the industry from the inside. He was educated at the finest institutions, boarding school, then Amherst College, then the Juilliard School, that legendary training ground for performers. Everything was in place for a smooth and privileged ascent into the family business. Anthony did pursue acting, working as an actor, singer, screenwriter, and film producer over the years. But his story took a darker turn than anyone would have wished, because the very fame and access that surrounded him from birth proved to be as much a trap as a gift. By multiple accounts, Anthony struggled for a long and painful stretch with addiction, with drugs, and with drinking, the kind of self-destructive spiral that has swallowed so many children of Hollywood who grew up with too much within reach and too few limits on it. There were real fears within the family that he might follow the same tragic path that had taken his half-brother Jonathan, that the darkness might win. There is a particular trap that catches so many children of the very famous, and Anthony seems to have walked straight into it. When everything is handed to you, when doors open before you knock and money is never quite real and consequences always seem to land on someone else, it becomes terribly easy to lose the thread of who you actually are. The privilege that looks from the outside like a golden cushion can function from the inside like quicksand. Some of the most lost young people in the world are the ones who were given the most and asked for the least in return. His personal life bore the marks of that turbulence. He married the supermodel Cheryl Tiegs, and for a time the union placed him squarely in the glossy celebrity spotlight, a fixture of the very tabloid world his father had always regarded with wary distance. But his struggles reportedly strained the marriage, and it ended in divorce. A very public unraveling that by some accounts left him reeling. It also strained his relationship with his father, that steady, principled man who had already lost one son and now had to watch another one flirt with ruin. There is a particular anguish in that, and it is easy to imagine the private conversations, the worry, the helplessness of a father who could play a rescuer on screen but could not simply script his own son back to safety. And yet Anthony's story, unlike Jonathan's, did not end in tragedy. He became a father himself, welcoming a son named Zach in the early 1990s, and fatherhood, along with the hard work of recovery, seems to have given him something to hold on to. He steadied. He rebuilt. He continued to work in and around the film world, and he stepped back from the brink that had once seemed so terrifyingly close. His is perhaps the most human arc of all 5 siblings, the story of someone who was handed everything, nearly lost it all, and then found his way back. It is not a fairy tale, and it does not pretend to be. It is simply the real and difficult account of a man who inherited a golden name and had to learn the hard way that a name cannot save you. Only the work of saving yourself can do that. If Anthony's path ran closest to the edge, his younger sister took the family's inheritance, its conscience, its love of storytelling, its instinct to stand up for the voiceless, and forged it into a career that has quietly become one of the most morally serious in modern documentary film. The daughter who told the hard truths. Cecilia Peck was born in 1958, the youngest of Gregory Peck's 5 children and his only daughter. She was, in many ways, the child who grew up closest to the legend at his most fully realized, the daughter of the man who had already become an icon, already won his Oscar for Atticus Finch, already settled into the role of elder statesman of American film. And it is Cecilia who has spoken most warmly and most publicly about what he was actually like as a father, describing a man who was kind, loving, strict when he needed to be, and genuinely, unmistakably good. The best and most loving father in the world. In her own words, Cecilia began her career in front of the camera as an actress. She appeared in films through the 1980s and early 1990s, including Oliver Stone's Wall Street and the cult thriller Killing Zoe. And she earned a Golden Globe nomination for her performance in the television film The Portrait, a project in which she poignantly played the daughter of a character portrayed by her own father. There is something almost too fitting about that. The real daughter of Gregory Peck, cast as the daughter of Gregory Peck, blurring the line between the family and the art, the way this family so often has. For a while, it looked as though she might build a conventional Hollywood acting career, following the well-worn path of the movie star's child, who becomes a movie star in turn. But something in her, that same restless moral seriousness that ran through the whole family, pulled her in a different direction. She moved behind the camera, founding her own production company and dedicating herself to documentary filmmaking, and specifically to the kind of documentary that shines a light on injustice and on the people brave enough to confront it. Her subjects tell you everything about her values. She began by turning the camera on her own father, producing A Conversation with Gregory Peck, an intimate portrait of the man during his later years, when he toured the country doing evenings of storytelling for audiences of every age. It premiered at the Cannes Film Festival and aired on public television, a loving daughter's gift to the world and to her father both. From there, her work grew steadily bolder. She co-directed Shut Up and Sing, a searing documentary about the ferocious backlash the Dixie Chicks faced after one of them criticized the president over the Iraq War, a film about the price of speaking your conscience in public, which was shortlisted for an Academy Award and won a shelf of critics' honors. Then came the film that may define her legacy. Cecilia directed and produced Brave Miss World, which followed Linor Abargil, an Israeli model who was raped just weeks before being crowned Miss World, and who spent years afterward on a courageous crusade to confront her attacker and to break the silence surrounding sexual assault, reaching out to survivors around the globe. The film took 5 years to make, and Cecilia followed her subject through some of the rawest moments imaginable, refusing to look away from a kind of trauma most filmmakers would flinch from. It was nominated for an Emmy and became, for countless viewers, something more than a documentary. Survivors wrote to Abargil and to Cecilia by the thousands, many of them speaking about their own assaults for the very first time in their lives, prompted by the courage they had watched on screen. It became, in the truest sense, a lifeline. Cecilia followed it with Seduced. Inside the NXIVM Cult, a harrowing series about the women who escaped a criminal organization that had trafficked and abused them under the guise of a self-help group, and later turned her lens on other stories of coercion and control. Again and again, she has planted herself on the side of the survivor against the predator, the individual against the institution, the truth against the machinery built to bury it. Look at the through line in that body of work. Every one of Cecilia's major films is about someone standing up against overwhelming power on behalf of the vulnerable, about survivors, about conscience, about the courage to tell a truth the world would rather not hear. It is, when you think about it, the exact moral territory her father spent his career exploring on screen, the lone principled figure standing against the crowd. Atticus Finch defended the defenseless in a courtroom. His daughter defends them with a camera. The medium changed. The mission did not. Cecilia married the writer Daniel Voll, and the two have 2 children, including a son named Harper, named in honor of Harper Lee, the author of To Kill a Mockingbird, the novel that gave her father his greatest role. That single detail says almost everything about how consciously this family carries its own legacy, how deliberately it braids together the art and the values and the love that Gregory Peck left behind. Where they stand today, more than 2 decades after Gregory Peck died peacefully in his sleep in June of 2003 at the age of 87, his surviving children remain bound together by the extraordinary father they shared and by the very different lives they each built out of that inheritance. Jonathan is gone, lost in 1975 at just 30, and his memory remains the quiet, sorrowful heart of the family's story, a reminder of the one grief that all his father's fame and goodness could never undo. Stephen spent his life at the helm of the nation's largest effort to house and heal homeless veterans, one of the most quietly consequential humanitarian careers any child of Hollywood has ever led. Carey moved from the campaign trail to the school system, spending his later decades opening educational doors for the children the system too often ignored, married to a celebrated artist and remembered as a devoted public servant. Anthony survived the addiction that nearly consumed him, rebuilt his life, became a father, and continued to work in the film world, his story one of hard-won recovery rather than easy privilege. And Cecilia has become one of the most morally serious documentary filmmakers of her generation, telling the stories of survivors and truth-tellers, and raising a family that carries the Peck legacy forward with obvious pride. Between them, the children gave Gregory Peck grandchildren who continue to move through the worlds of art and film, including the actor Ethan Peck, Stephen's son, who has carried the family name back onto the screen for a new generation, stepping into roles his grandfather might have marveled at. Cecilia's own son bears the first name Harper, a permanent, living tribute to the book that gave the family its defining story. The Peck name still means something rare in American culture, a byword for decency, and the people who carry it have, for the most part, tried to live up to that heavy and beautiful burden rather than simply spend the inheritance of it. It is worth noticing what none of these children did. Not one of them turned the Peck name into a tabloid brand, or cashed it in for easy money, or spent a lifetime trading on a fame they had not earned. Even Anthony, who came closest to being consumed by the celebrity world, ultimately walked away from its worst temptations rather than deeper into them. The others barely touched it at all. They became a veterans advocate, a public servant, a documentary filmmaker, choosing almost to a person the harder and quieter road. In an age when so many children of the famous do precisely the opposite, that restraint tells you something about the man who raised them, what their story leaves behind. It is tempting, when we look at Gregory Peck, to let the myth swallow the man, to see only Atticus Finch, the perfect father, the moral centre, the calm and towering figure who always knew the right thing to do. And by his children's own testimony, there was more truth in that image than we have any right to expect. He really was, at home, something very close to the man he played on screen. But the fuller story, the one his 5 children actually lived, is richer and sadder and more human than any movie. It includes a son lost to a darkness no father could reach. It includes another son who came home from war and spent his life saving the wounded. It includes a public servant who kept serving even after the voters said no, and a son who nearly destroyed himself before finding his way back, and a daughter who turned her father's on-screen conscience into a real-world weapon against injustice. It includes triumph and relapse, grief and grace, all tangled together the way they are in every real family, famous or not. There is a temptation, when a family carries a famous name, to grade its children against the legend, to ask whether any of them measured up to the towering figure at the centre of it all. But that may be the wrong question entirely. None of Gregory Peck's children became Gregory Peck, because no one could, any more than the children of any remarkable parent can simply become that parent again. What they did instead was take the particular thing he stood for, the conviction that a life should be spent in service of something larger than yourself, and carry it into rooms he never entered. A homeless shelter for veterans, a struggling public school, an editing bay where a survivor's story was being shaped into something that might free others. These are not movie sets. There are no marks to hit, no lines to remember, no director to call cut when a scene goes wrong. There is only the daily, unscripted work of trying to be good in a world that rarely makes it easy. That, in the end, may be the truest thing the Peck children reveal about their father. Not that he raised a perfect family, because no one does. And this family knew grief and addiction and public failure as intimately as any. But that he raised, mostly, good people, people who took the enormous privilege they were handed and tried, each in their own flawed and striving way, to turn it towards something decent. A veteran's shelter, a child's classroom, a survivor's story finally told, even a life pulled back from the edge. Gregory Peck spent his career teaching audiences what goodness looked like from the safe distance of a movie screen. His children spent their lives trying to actually live it. In a world with no script, no retakes, and no guarantee of a happy ending, and given everything they each carried, that effort may be the finest performance the Peck family ever gave. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.